Thank you all for joining. As Claudia said, I did grow grapes and make some wine here at my home starting in the late 1990s. And this talk is kind of an accumulation of what I've learned over that time. But it's really just an overview of what you can learn about growing grapes. And what I'd like to do is to give a shout out to UC Davis. Back in the 90s, I took a series of small vineyard classes there. They have some great 1- and 2-day classes available. Okay, so backyard grapes in California is a good match. California produces 99% of all of the commercial grapes grown in the U.S. Believe it or not, there's wine produced in every state of the United States, even Alaska. But 80% of it is grown in California, is produced in California. So we live in a great place to support grape growing. That should come as no surprise to anybody here. So in addition to wine, there's a lot of other reasons to grow grapes. In the Master Gardener demonstration garden in Walnut Creek, we have 4 different varieties of table grapes, and that we've been growing there for the last 10 years. So you can, a lot of people here will be interested in grapes for the fruit. You can also preserve them. In addition to wine, you can preserve them by making raisins, by making jelly. And maybe an underappreciated aspect is just as a nice landscape element. My wife was a little leery about me putting this small vineyard in our backyard, but after a few years, when it got established, she grew to really like how it looked in all seasons. It changes over the year, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But I'm an advocate. I love the way it looks, and I would encourage you guys to think of it in that way also. What we're going to cover today is a lot of what is in that course, the UC Davis course, which is planning, installation, phenology, which is a fancy way to say the seasonal life cycle of the grapevine, some maintenance that your vine will require over the year, and we'll take a look at some pests and diseases that are common for backyard grapes. I'll kind of go quickly through the planning and installation since most people seem to have grapes, but we'll focus on the second half of the talk a little more detail. Okay, so for those of you who are looking at perhaps putting some grapes in the backyard, some of the things you'll need to consider when starting to plan are what location, if there are different parts of your backyard that would be better for the grapes than others, what varietals you want to plant. There's quite a few different varieties to choose from. An important one is what quantity to plant. So it might be that you just want to have a couple of vines to cover an arbor, and so you have a good idea about how many vines you want to put in. But if you're planning to make wine or you want to use them for table grapes, then it's good to have an idea of how much you're going to get out of each vine, so you don't plant too much or not enough for what you want to do. I'll talk about the layout of a vineyard. There's issues with spacing, how far apart we want to keep those vines so that they're healthy and then also structural support. You know, all vines need some type of structural support. And in the wild, vines will actually use trees as the support, and they'll send their shoots up into trees. But when we're doing this in the backyard, we want to be able to control where the vine goes, and so we'll be planning out our support for that. As far as location goes, the two most important things about selecting a site are a site that has good drainage, and a good amount of sun. So if you've been up in Napa, you notice that there's a lot of vineyards on hillsides. You know, there's a naturally good drainage there, and for you really want about 8 hours of sun per day for the grapes. So those two are really the two most important considerations. Grapes only need kind of a medium fertility soil. They don't, you can grow grapes in a lot of different locations. I was just in Sicily a few weeks ago and saw vines up on Mount Etna in volcanic soil. There are vines grown in a lot of different areas of the world, and unless you suspect there are some defects in your soil, like some chemicals or things that would affect any kind of plant, you may or may not need a soil test before you get started. But I wouldn't put off putting a vineyard in because maybe some other plants haven't been growing well there. Grapes can grow in a pretty wide variety of soils. You'll hear a lot about microclimates in relation to grapes that are grown for winemaking. You're probably not gonna in your backyard run into different microclimates. I actually have a little low spot in my yard that gets very cold and will freeze. If your property is of a size where you have those issues, you might think about that when selecting a site. But for most backyards, that's probably not an issue. So as far as choosing a variety, there's something like 10,000 different varieties that have been identified. Hundreds of them that are typically used. For table grapes, Thompson seedless is one of the most popular. We've in the demonstration garden in Walnut Creek, we're growing 4 different types. We have a Glenora and Tom Cord grapes that are both red varietals. And then we have a Neptune and Marquis grape that are green grapes. I bought those at Stark Brothers. I went and took a look at their site last week, and they have maybe 10 or 12 different varieties of table grapes. So they including Thompson seedless. And so I'd encourage you to experiment with maybe some varieties that you wouldn't find in a store, and also come by the garden when in the late summer when the grapes are ripening. You can see what type of grapes we're growing there. For raisins, I would say something like 95% of the raisins produced in California are Thompson seedless grapes. And so if you're interested in that, that's a good variety to choose. And as for wine grapes, I ended up choosing Sangiovese because it was something I liked to drink, and it seemed like it was hot enough here in Danville to support growing that. Um, Across Contra Costa County, we have a pretty wide variety of climates, and so um, one of the ways that uh, grape growers for wine grapes will determine what type of varieties they'll choose is to measure. There's a factor called the growing degree days that was developed by Albert Winkler at UC Davis back in the 1930s, I believe, or 30s or 40s. And he identified 5 different regions based on how much. So a degree day is how many days over 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And so if you have an average temperature during a day of 60 degrees, you would count that as 10 degree days. And so we would add those up between April and October, and then use that number to determine, how much is available for the wine grapes to grow. And so on the low end, some of the regions would be like in the Loire Valley and the Central Coast, and that would kind of correspond as far as degree days go to in Contra Costa to El Cerrito. And then moving up to the next region would be like Bordeaux is kind of equivalent in Contra Costa to Moraga as far as degree days go. And then getting warmer still, Sonoma would correspond to Briones, regional park, that area, Alhambra Valley, and so on. So there's you can find out how many degree days are typical for the part of Contra Costa that you live in, and then map that onto the types of grapes that'll do the best in those areas. So if you're planning to grow wine grapes, that's a good way to try and narrow down which varietals you might want to plant. There was actually some talk right before we started about native rootstock versus grafting varietals onto other rootstocks. And so this is something you might have heard about. There's a pest of grapevines called phylloxera. It's a little insect that's like an aphid. And it was responsible for wiping out a lot of the vineyards in France and Europe back in the 1870s or 1880s. And what happened was some vines from North America, which are naturally phylloxera resistant, were brought over to Europe, and then the aphid, that phylloxera insect, went all through Europe and wiped out entire vineyards. And so the practice began to combat this of grafting a European variety, wine grape variety onto North American rootstock, which was phylloxera resistant. And so if you're planning to put in wine grapes, you'll often want to choose, there are different nurseries up in Sonoma, Napa, where you can choose what rootstock you want and then what varietal you want. And so if you're doing wine grapes, that's something you should investigate. If you're doing table grapes, most of those that are sold around here are American rootstocks because they're North American varietals, and so you don't really have to worry about grafting those onto a different rootstock because they'll be naturally resistant to the phylloxera. Okay, so the next thing about planting is, how many vines do you want to plant? So when I got started, I was interested in making wine, and so I did some calculations about how many grapes I would need to, how many vines I would need to plant in order to make a barrel of wine, and so it was something like 100 vines, and I had just a limited amount of space, and so I kind of tried to make that fit. I'll talk a little bit about what mistakes I made regarding that later. But for wine grapes, you can a rough rule of thumb is about 1/2 to 2 gallons of wine per vine, based on the vine producing enough grapes to get that much juice out. For table grapes, it's about 30 to 50 pounds per vine. Our experience at our garden at the demonstration, the demonstration garden in Walnut Creek is, I think this year we got 500 pounds of grapes out of the 12 vines that we have. So keep that in mind when you're deciding how many vines to plant. If you're planting too many, you can always give them away or make juice or something else, but you should kind of have that in mind. When I selected the varieties for the demonstration garden, I chose ones, some that were early ripening. So they would ripen more in like late July, and some that were more late ripening. So they came in August and late August. And so that's another factor when trying to pick some varieties for table grapes is, maybe pick a couple of different varieties that will ripen at different times so that you're not overwhelmed with literally tons of grapes all at once, and you can kind of have those spaced out a little bit. And as far as raisins go, I haven't done raisins before, but apparently a pound of raisins takes about 4 or 5 pounds of grapes to source. So so you can kind of keep that in mind when deciding how many vines to plant. So the next topic is layout. This is a picture of my backyard before I planted. So I had laid out this space, and like I said, I was trying to fit all of these vines in there. So I ended up doing 6-foot spacing between the rows and 6 foot between each vine, which turned out to be a little too close. So the problem with that is that with only 6 feet between the vines, every year the vines would grow into each other and overlap, and I had a problem controlling the canopy, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So the 6 feet between the rows is probably okay. I would probably, if I was going to do it again today, I would probably go more like 8 feet, 10 feet if you're actually have a big enough space that you're driving some kind of a tractor or something in between the rows. But probably 8 feet apart, and I would do 8 to 10 feet between the vines, because they're very prolific. I mean, the vines at our garden, we are constantly trimming them back, and we do get a great crop out of them, but it's a lot of work to to keep on top of that. For arbors, you can, the vines will spread out over the top of the arbor, and so you typically don't need many vines to cover an arbor. You can get 50 to 100 square feet of coverage per vine for covering an arbor. So for typical installations where you're doing something like this, where you have rows of vines and or even a single row of vines, you'll want to plan for how you're going to support that vine. There's a couple of different factors involved. You want to think about how you're going to prune those vines. There are certain varieties that are better if you cane prune them versus what's called a cordon and spur pruning. I'll get into that a little later. But what I'm showing here is a couple of different approaches to what your supports would look like. So you'd have a stake going up in the middle and a cross arm at the top to be able to spread all of those the shoots each year out. On the left side, we have a 7-foot stake because we're doing cane pruning of Thompson seedless here, and we'll have a trunk that goes up to that top crossbar, and then each year those canes will spread out along wires that are stretched in between those crossbars. You can also do a double crossbar system, so it just gives you more area to support different canes at different levels. And then on the right side, there's an example of something that's shorter. So we're talking maybe 4 feet tall, and where you'd have a wire at about waist height, 3 foot or so, that would hold the cordon, and then the canes would grow, the spurs and canes would grow up from there. And they'll become more obvious as I talk about pruning, but I'm mentioning it here just as part of your planning. You'll want to consider what type of pruning you're going to do, and that will help determine what type of trellising that you want to design. The other benefit of doing this trellising is you can have a wire that supports your irrigation system. So if you're doing a drip system, you can lift that off the ground and put that along a wire that's maybe a foot off the ground. So alternatives to the trellising, or we've talked about arbors, and for backyards, that's a great option. It's beautiful to have the grapes growing up over an arbor and all the grapes hanging down. It's a really nice way to do that. You can use a fence, and maybe have a wire that's off the fence a little bit, so that the vine's not actually attached to the fence itself, but that's a good way to support your grapes. And then I'll mention head train grapes, which is what one of my colleagues, John Fike, does with his grapes at home, and that's the picture on the top right here. And this is done a lot with Zinfandel grapes in the wine country, where you have a stake that's supporting the trunk coming up from the ground, but then as the vine gets established, you're creating a goblet shape with a couple of different spurs. And over the years, these will grow into something thick like you're seeing here. And then each year, you'll have canes coming off of that head train vine, and so that those stand alone. You don't need to put those on any kind of a trellis system. So the next part I'm going to talk about is installation. It's actually a good time to talk about that if you're thinking about putting a new vineyard in for next year, because now's the time to start thinking about going through all the planning stages that we just talked about, and getting your site prepared. You want to get your irrigation and the vine support in place, and then we can do this all over the winter, and then be ready to plant our vines in the spring, and begin that training period that I talked about, which is going to be a couple of years, starting after the plants are put in. So so now we're ready to start thinking about getting our backyard ready for planting next spring. So what can we do now? So the first thing people think about maybe is doing a soils test. I mean, it's not a bad idea to do a soils test anyway, but like I mentioned before, grapes are pretty forgiving as far as what kind of soils they'll grow in, and it doesn't need to be super fertile to be successful. If you have any hard pan, and that's like a layer of dirt that is almost impermeable under the soil or on the top, you want to break those up. The grapes, you want to have fairly loose soil down to maybe 30 inches or so. And so there's a couple of ways to work on breaking that up. In the garden, we've used a broad fork in the past to break up some of that hard pan. In my own case, I used a post hole digger, and went through and used that to break up the dirt around where I was planting each vine. Another way to kind of the master gardeners will encourage you to plant cover crops over the winter. There are some that have very deep roots and will help break up any soil compaction you have, like rye and mustard grasses. And so that's something you can take care of in the fall, between now and the end of the year, to get ready. It's important when the vines are first getting established to have some irrigation. If it's only a few vines, you can hand water those. But if you have any number that more than a few vines, then you'll want to put some kind of drip irrigation in place. It's very important to get the right amount of water on those grapes at the beginning, when they're first getting established. So when you're putting your trellis in, if that's what you're using for support of the vines, it's a great structure to be able to hang your irrigation off of. And so that's what we did in the garden. For those 12 vines that we put in, we hung some drip line about a foot off the ground, and getting it up off the ground will enable you to do weeding and clearing out without damaging the irrigation components, and it'll still be effective in watering the grapes. People have asked me in the past about dry farming grapes, and in the beginning you really can't do that. You really you need the water to get them established. We've actually turned the water off at the garden for the last few years, partially because the grapes are so well established that they've kind of they've sent roots out into other parts of the vineyard that do get watered, so they get plenty of water as part of the general watering we do in the raised beds or the planting beds and the orchard that are on either side of our little vineyard. And you know, that may be the case in your backyard as well. I mean, you may, after those vines get established, there may be enough watering going on that you can stop watering the grapes specifically, but typically you'll if you don't have any water sources around, you'll need to be watering them through the growing season. Okay, so now we have our ground prepared. We thought about irrigation. We can start thinking about setting up a trellis. So I'll talk a little bit about the trellis that I put in. What I have is here, the main component is this metal stake that will support the wires. You can see the wires at different levels. I have one wire down low for the irrigation. I have another wire about 3 feet off the ground where I was going, where I ran the cordons for where I was training up the horizontal branches or cordons along that vine, along that wire, and then wires at the top where I could tie up the new growth each year. So I had a number of wires up on top for that. To keep the stakes in place and keep tension on the wires, I have an end post that was a wooden peeler core, and then I used a wire vise. That's a specific brand of tightening device that I'll show a picture of in a minute, but it will grab the wire on one end and it won't let the wire back up. So you can keep pulling on the wire and keep it taut, because over the years those wires will start to sag, especially as they're supporting the weight of the grapes and the vines. And so they'll stretch a little bit. You'll need to pull those tighter each year. And to keep that end post in place, I used an earth anchor. So you go to this next slide. So what this earth anchor is there's a little helix at the bottom, and you basically screw it into the ground, and it's got an eyelet at the top. These are really heavy metal. I mean, it's probably a 1/2 inch diameter metal rod. So I screwed those in, and that helps keep that end post in place. The middle picture here is the wire vise, the device that I was talking about. And here, you know, this 10 gauge wire gets pushed after drilling a hole through the post. The wire gets pushed through that hole and into this wire vise, and there's a little spring inside that prevents the wire from backing out again. So so you can pull it pretty tight. And then this is just a close-up of the vineyard stake, and you could, what I wanted to show here was the little notches on the sides and on the top to be able to hold those wires that you're running up and down the rows. So part of installation is training that new vine those first couple of years. What we're really want to do this first year is just get a trunk up to those wires on your trellis, or if you're putting it on an arbor, you want to get that a strong leader, that trunk going up the one post of your arbor. Or if you're doing head train vines, you want that, a strong trunk. And so you'd have a stake that's supporting that vine, and you'll as the that shoot grows, you'll tie that up to the stake or to the arbor post or to your trellis. And often in that first year, you won't get a very strong leader like that. You typically you would have 3 or 4 shoots coming out of that, out of your initial planting, and there might be one that first year that's strong enough, but often there's not, and you could just cut them all the way back down at the end of the growing season. I'll talk about that on the dormant pruning part. You can cut that all the way back to just a couple of buds, and then in year 2 you would be training that initial trunk. And often that'll happen where in the first year you don't have any shoots that are strong enough, and it takes a year for the roots to get established, and the plant will be a lot stronger in the second year and be able to push something up. And then in those first couple of years, you're really just trying to align the shoots. So in this bottom left picture, you see there's 2 cordons or 2 branches that are trying to get established on one of those lower wires. And so you'll keep those as permanent parts of your installation. And then in subsequent years, the grapes will grow. Each of the shoots will come out of those cordons, and that's where your fruit will grow. But this may take 2 or 3 years to get that shape established. What your goal is for a new vine. Okay, so see, 6:50. We're going to go quickly through this part. So we're talking about now the seasonal life cycle of the plant. The beginning of the year in the northern hemisphere, all the vines are dormant, in the wintertime, and sometime around March or April, late February or March, you'll get what's called bud break, and that's where the vine is starting to come back to life, and the buds that were created in the previous year's growth will start to open up and send shoots out. And then once those shoots are, have grown for a few weeks, we'll get flowering in May timeframe, May-June timeframe, and then you'll start to see little clusters of grapes forming, and so your fruit gets set in usually early June, and then the next The Verizon is the time when the grapes start changing color. So all grapes will be little hard green grape fruit when they first are forming, and as they grow and they'll start changing color. Then we get to ripening, and then harvest, and then after harvest, all the leaves will drop off as winter approaches, and then the vine will go dormant for the winter. And so the reason we're talking about this is there's different maintenance tasks that you want to do at different points. So starting with dormancy, the kind of the most important task you'll do in the vineyard is that dormant pruning. So this will happen in January or February. Typically, you want to do it before bud break. So before the vine comes back to life, you want to be able to have all your pruning done. The two main types of pruning are cane pruning, called cane pruning, and then cordon and spur pruning. The reason you would choose one or the other is a lot to do with what varietal you're choosing. So there are some varietals like Thompson seedless where the first few buds of so all fruit is grown on last year's wood. So after you prune back the shoots after the season is done, you'll prune back to a certain number of buds. So each the canes will be, they might be 8 feet long, 10 feet long, and they'll have buds all along them every couple of inches. And so in this cordon and spur technique that is shown at the bottom, you would cut those back to maybe like 1 or 2 or 3 buds. And that's what each of these little spurs are coming off the cordon. For certain varietals like Thompson seedless, those first few buds are not always fruitful. So in that case, you want to leave a longer cane, because the buds that will produce fruit are really, maybe buds 5, 6, 7, 8 along that year-old cane. And so for certain varieties, you want to do cane pruning, where we leave a nice long cane, and you might choose 3 or 4 canes for each vine, and then there might be 3 or 4 buds on each of those canes that will send shoots out in the new year, and that's where your fruit will set. Then there are other varieties that are fruitful in those first couple of buds, and so this cordon and spur pruning lets you control where the grapes are on your trellis a little bit. It's a little bit easier to control and manage those. And so this is one method where you have 2 cordons or 2 arms going horizontally. Those are permanent parts of the vine. And then about every 6 inches or so, you would establish a little spur, and each year cut back the canes to just a couple of buds on those spurs. And then in the new year, the canes will grow up vertically from those spurs, and you'll tie them onto higher wires, and that lets if you have your cordon down at 3 feet, then this puts all the fruit right where it's easy to harvest and easy to manage. So the fruit will be a 1.5 or 2 feet above your cordon, and so it'll be right at like shoulder height. So makes it it's one of the reasons why this cordon and spur pruning method is popular. Other maintenance issues, I talked about if you plant your vines too close, then you'll get this enormous amount of vegetative growth. And so there's times after bud break, when the shoots are starting to come out, where you'll want to kind of thin out the vine, and for each vine you may have 20 or 30 shoots coming out, of different buds, and so you want to kind of go through and thin those out so that you don't have this preponderance of green growing canopy, which if it's too thick, then there's not good airflow, there's not good sunlight penetration, and so you get more susceptible to different diseases and mildew and things like that. So it's important to do that canopy management. Cluster thinning is a practice of dropping some clusters of grapes. If the vine can support just so many and ripen just so many clusters of grapes, and a lot of vineyards will wineries will do this in order to focus more of the energy on the clusters that are left, and the theory is they would increase the quality of the grapes. There's some weeding that you might do during the year. It's mostly just in the foot around the base of your vines, to try and keep that clear so there's not competition for the water. And then there is some spraying that is useful to do. I never had any problem with powdery mildew in my vineyard, but we do at the garden. And so John, my colleague, has been spraying stylet oil on the vines early in the season. I believe he does that in the June timeframe to try and prevent powdery mildew from forming on the leaves and the grapes. Okay, we're getting close to my closing time, but I just have a few more things to talk about. We all are dealing with deer and raccoon and birds and things in our gardens. I've dealt with all of these things. The deer are a problem in the springtime because they love those tender shoots that are being pushed out of the vines. Really, exclusion is the only way to deal with the deer. They can jump, as you know, really high. It would take a 7-foot fence to really keep them out. What I found is I ended up putting a solid fence around my property, and since they couldn't see the vines, they didn't come in and eat the leaves. So when I initially planted my vineyard, it was an open fence, wire fence, and they could see over it. They could jump the fence, and they got in. And I had a couple of years where we came home from vacation in June, and there were 6 deer in the vineyard just having a snack. So they wiped out all of the green growth, which made it difficult for any grapes to form. So definitely a major pest in the vineyard. For birds, we use a bird netting that we surround the grapes vines with at the garden, and I've done on my vineyard, and that works great. You just have to be sure to close it at the bottom so they don't jump in from the ground and get caught up in the bird netting. For me, the most challenging was raccoons, because it turns out that grapes are one of their favorite foods. And I went through a few different rounds of trying to deal with the raccoons. I tried a motion sensitive water spray that mostly just got me wet and didn't affect the raccoons at all. What finally worked for me was putting in an electric fence. So I had I had a low fence around the vineyard. I put electric fence, a wire, a couple of wires around that, and that did the trick. I didn't have any problems with raccoons after that. We do have a rat problem at our garden. They seem to get in and get into the grapes, and so we do have some loss for that. But we ended up with 500 pounds of grapes, so that you can kind of deal with that with volume a little bit, but we're also working on a new project this fall to try and exclude them from the garden itself. I've talked a little bit about powdery mildew. That's a picture in the upper left there. You may have seen that on the leaves or on the grapes themselves. This stylet oil spraying is one way to combat that. And you have to be pretty diligent about that, doing that a couple of different sprays during the growing season. I did want to mention Eutypa. This is something that affected my vines, and I didn't identify it early enough. If you see in the picture on the upper right, there's one cordon going off to the left where there's no green growth on that. And that's an indication that you have this this virus, and so parts of the vine will die off. And the important thing to know about it is that it will be transmitted through clippers. So I inadvertently, since I didn't identify it soon enough, I inadvertently prune those dead pieces off my vine, use the same clippers to do my normal pruning, and ended up transmitting that through my vineyard. So there's no coming back from that. Once the vine dies off, it's gone. So definitely something to keep an eye on if you ever see that kind of die off in any part of your vineyard. Pierce's disease is something that doesn't seem to have affected backyard vineyards here. It's a big problem with commercial vineyards. There's a glassy wing sharpshooter insect that will transmit that, and so the main way to combat that is with controlling the insect itself. But we've never had questions about that. I've never seen it in backyard gardens here. So you might have heard about it, but it's not a big problem for backyard vineyards in Contra Costa.